Mike, if I want to believe in God, what I like to do is study the arguments of atheists. And one of those arguments says that if there were a God and it was a good God and God wanted us to know and love God, God would not be hidden. How do you answer that?
The argument that's received the most attention, I guess, over the last 25 years is Schellenberg's argument, which takes hiddenness to be a kind of evidential phenomenon, right? So basically, there are lots of people out there who aren't resisting a relationship with God in any way, but either for lack of evidence or for lack of having the concept of God, they don't believe in God. And Schellenberg thinks, if God loves these people, right, at a minimum, God's going to do what God can to remove obstacles to belief, right? I mean, obviously, not knowing that you exist
is an obstacle.
Or God's going to do what God can to remove obstacles to relationship, and not knowing that someone exists is a pretty clear and obvious obstacle to relationship, right? And so it's so that's the basic idea, right? If God's really loving everybody, and if God's open to relationship with everybody, then we just shouldn't find people who aren't resistant to a relationship with God, but still find themselves perfectly reasonably failing to believe in God. The argument hinges on assumptions about what divine love would look like, and those assumptions are grounded in just kind of our basic intuitions about loving relationships. Intuitions that we form by reflecting on, I think, just our own, as you might say, creaturely concept of love, right? So I know what it is to love my kids. I know what it is to love my wife. I don't know exactly what it is to be an excellent lover of kids or of my wife, but I feel like I know what it is to be minimally decent. And we think, if we just reflect on love in that way, this again is speaking as the objector. If we just reflect on love in that way, we could see that this condition that Schellenberg is setting out is just it's a minimal condition on being loving, much less perfectly loving. So we know what it is to love as a human being, right? We don't totally know what love would look like for an absolutely perfect being, right? So theologians often talk about God as transcendent, right? God's sort of, in some sense, beyond creaturely concepts. The predicates that we apply to God, we say that God's wise, God's powerful, God knows things, God's loving. Those predicates are at best analogically related to those predicates as they're applied to human beings. So we have an analogical grasp of it. We could tell analogies and things like that to try to elucidate it. But I think given that our concept of love is only analogically related to the kind of love that God actually displays, we're not really entitled to trust our intuitions about love we're not entitled to trust the sort of analysis that we might arrive at philosophically in making inferences about what would follow from the fact that there's a perfectly loving divine being.
That sounds a little bit like skeptical theism as applied to the problem of evil. Are you taking a variant of that, applying it to the problem of hiddenness?
Yeah, I think that's basically right. So skeptical theism as applied to the problem of evil is something like this. The arguer from evil says, at least on one way of arguing, says, look at this or that particular instance of horrendous evil. That seems to have no point, right? But one thing that we know is that a perfectly loving being isn't going to permit absolutely pointless, horrible evil, right? Yeah, you just think about the kinds of evils that you allow to happen to your loved ones, right? So when I was a little kid, I got taken for an allergy test. So I'm like 5 or 6 years old. The allergy test involves, 10 shots up this arm. And that's like horrific for a little kid, right? I was dragged in kicking and screaming. My parents helped hold me down, right? How could they do that if they loved me? Well, it served a greater good, right? If that was absolutely pointless and they knew it was absolutely pointless, we'd say, that's not very loving toward your kid, right? So the arguer from evil says, this is a perfectly loving being isn't going to permit pointless evil. This looks pointless, therefore there's no perfectly loving being. The skeptical theist comes in and says, well, now wait a minute. I mean, you're working with a 3-pound piece of meat between your ears here, and God, if God exists, is omniscient. Like, don't you think there might be goods beyond your ken that are served by this evil?
So you are applying that to the problem of God's hiddenness. That, in other words, that God has a greater good reason for not being so obvious in the world that people who are not resisting God would want to be there. But God's not doing that. So these people are in what seemingly looks like in a bad position. Maybe they'll never believe in God because they don't see God. But there's a greater good. Are you obligated to define what that greater good is?
Yeah, so I don't think so. Taking the analogy with skeptical theism, the whole idea there is there might be goods that we simply can't grasp, or relations between goods and evils that we simply can't fathom, right? And the idea with divine hiddenness is roughly the same. With the problem of evil, the assumption typically is if there are greater goods, they're greater human goods. In other words, they're greater goods. They're goods that somehow are human-oriented. What I've argued with divine hiddenness is I don't actually think that there's reason to think that divine hiddenness would have to serve greater human goods either.
So that's a bigger universe that you can have goodness occur in. And God has some bigger vision that who knows what.
Yeah. So here's one analogy that I've used. We all know people who don't interact with us in exactly the ways that we want them to, right? They're quiet when we want them to talk. They're just socially kind of weird, Before we get to know them, we might be put off by their behavior or whatever. After we get to know them, we think, oh, well, that's just so-and-so. We understand that their behavior is compatible with their love. One thing we usually don't think is that they always ought to adjust their behavior to cater to my particular desires, right? People are allowed to be who they are. And even if it pains us to a certain extent. A kind of interesting example from literature is Chaim Potok's novel, The Chosen. Yeah. In that novel, the protagonist's best friend has a father who only speaks to him when they're studying Talmud together, right? The protagonist is totally put off by this. He thinks your father is by the middle and end of the novel. He's just outright saying, "I don't like your father. Your father's kind of a jerk." And the son says, "I don't necessarily like the way it goes, but my dad's a great man, and I know he loves me." But so it's a painful mode of interaction. And it's not so clear, I guess I want to say, that the father is just obligated to not impose that kind of pain, right? In that particular example, I'm not sure my intuitions necessarily go exactly where the author wants my intuitions to go. But I guess the point is we don't just assume that people ought to automatically alter their personality to cater to our interests and desires. And my thought about God is God has a personality too. God is also going to have goods that may not be human-centric, that might be served by, the overall pattern of behavior that we call divine hiddenness, which, again, is going to include the sort of absence of certain kinds of evidence that Schellenberg points to, but also certain kinds of absence of experience that, there are people like Mother Teresa who long for particular experiences of God, and who struggle as a result, right? And the hiddenness phenomenon is going to include that sort of thing as well. And there might be just other goods, not human-centric goods, that are served by all of that.